Our guest on this episode of the Paseo podcast is Constanza Eliana Chinea. She's a yoga teacher, activist, consultant, speaker, producer. Oh my gosh, hang on, I just dropped my list. There's so many accolades here to our guest today. But I think as we start every episode, it's best to let our guests introduce themselves. So Constanza, what should our audience know about you?
Yeah, really happy to be here. Thank you for the lovely intro. I've been in the wellness industry for about 11 years. So that's kind of my professional background. And for the last 2 years, professionally switched over to the anti-racism and decolonial space. So I've been doing anti-racism education and training for the past 2 years and lots of decolonization work for the past 3 to 4 years. So that's kind of like my professional background. My personal background, I am Boricua. Both of my parents are Boricua, born and raised by way of Luquillo and San Juan. We were talking about that earlier, Bayamon. And most of my family still lives on the island with the exception of my mom, myself, and a couple other family members are in the United States. Right now, I am on Tongva land, which is Los Angeles, California. And what else can I say? I've got a couple dogs running around. Animal lover over here. But yeah, that's a little bit of my background.
You're on the West Coast. So what's it like being a Boricua in Cali? I know before we started recording, we were talking about the Boricua population out there. But you mind speaking a little bit about your experience on the West Coast?
When I moved to the Midwest, it was about 5 years ago. When I moved to the West Coast, it was about 5 years ago. And what I can tell you about the West versus everywhere else, especially the East side, the East Coast, is that everything is a lot more laid back here. It's very chill. Obviously, I'm surrounded by palm trees. I'm living by the ocean, so it does remind me of home. But there's nothing quite like Boricua culture. There's nothing quite like being, in Chicago, in the Boricua, space. There's nothing quite like being in New York, in the Boricua space there. The Puerto Rican Day Parade, nothing like it. There's nothing like being on the island. So anytime you're surrounded by your own people, it gives you that cozy feeling of home. It just kind of keeps you grounded. So, on the West Coast, we don't really have that. LA is a very friendly place for Latinx in general. But for Boricuas, it's very, very difficult to find that community that's not super spread out in the suburbs. And, you don't have to drive 2 hours to, get to a party. It's a little bit harder over here.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like maybe you may not be finding that Boricua community that's similar to New York, which is like the mecca of Boricuas. It does sound like you're doing some really good work trying to create those little pockets of community with your practice, which is a great segue because I did want to ask you a bit about your practice. So you are the founder of Embody Inclusivity. Can you tell us a bit more? What is Embody Inclusivity? Why did you decide to found this practice?
Yeah, so Embody Inclusivity really stemmed out of the multiple different experiences that I had in the wellness community in general, but more specifically in the yoga industry. I've been a yoga practitioner for 11 years, so I've been in the space for 11 years, and I've been a yoga teacher for about 9 years. So all of those years of experience culminated in a lot of different racialized events, a lot of racism, prejudice, microaggressions, just a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily equate with the yoga industry because the wellness industry in general does a really good job of making you think like, oh, it's so positive, it's so wholesome, it's so nice, right? Mm-hmm. But it's still very heavily dominated by white folks. So it was definitely an experience that I felt very important to create some sort of collective where we could talk about anti-racism, we could talk about social justice, and that people of color, particularly Black, Indigenous people of color, could be centered. Our experiences could be centered. So that's why I created Embody Inclusivity in general, because my experiences are so steeped in the yoga industry. That's where it's been so far. But now I'm really branching out to include multiple forms of wellness, including mental health by way of therapists, and dietitians, people who are more body positive, more and more body inclusive, I should say. And all different forms of wellness, which include our own indigenous practices by way of Africa, by way of indigenous native culture, Taino culture. So really kind of branching out to make it even more inclusive than just the yoga industry.
So I imagine this all comes from your passion that you've developed for yoga, for wellness. Can you take us a little bit back in time? When and how did you discover your passion for yoga, for wellness?
Yeah, so I was in my very early 20s going through a very rough time. So I think, anybody who has had somewhat of an immigrant experience might be able to relate to the fact that when you're uprooted from your home, for me in particular, being raised in Puerto Rico and then having to move to a new country, learning a new language, having to learn a new culture, it was for many, many years, the assimilation process, whether it was forced or I, had to do it out of survival, it uprooted me in a certain way. I didn't feel very balanced, and I didn't feel grounded. I didn't feel like I was at home or that I was accepted most of the time. So I had a lot of mental health issues that I was dealing with, and I can't remember exactly who it was, where I saw it, but somebody somewhere at the time suggested yoga, as most people hear about. Yoga is really good for the body, it's really good for the mind. So I decided to try it. That was 11 years ago, and I just was immediately hooked. And what I really learned to love about yoga in general was the philosophy of it, and the lifestyle. It wasn't necessarily going to a yoga studio, being on a sticky rubber mat and doing a bunch of moves for an hour or two. What I really appreciated about the practice was the entire lifestyle. It was more so of like changing your patterns, your habitual patterns, changing the way you think about yourself, the relationship that you have with yourself and others, the relationship that you have with the environment, the relationship that you create with animals. And that for me was the most important part. So I decided to, about 2 years into my practice, I decided to do a very traditional classical yoga training rooted in a lineage based in South Asia, in India. And when I took my training, the deeper philosophy that I was taught there, and how to really be a yoga practitioner, what that taught me was just a completely different mindset that I didn't have before. And, before I was a binge alcoholic. I was going out partying probably 3 to 5 nights out of the week. It was a lot. I was binge drinking until I passed out or blacked out. I was having a lot of panic attacks. I didn't enjoy the work that I was doing. Didn't have very great relationships, particular romantic relationships. They were very toxic. And I was really depressed. And so when I found something that taught me to have a lifestyle that really focused on self-empowerment, that really focused on taking care of you, it was a complete game changer. So that's kind of what brought me into it. But what I have also learned in the last couple of years, as I have gone deeper into my decolonization journey, is that the yoga has been a stepping stone towards reclaiming my own ancestral spiritual practices and being really proud of where I come from, being really proud of the wellness practices that have been passed down to us that aren't necessarily trendy, right? Like we don't see them on the magazines. There's no celebrities that are, out here claiming Santeria, right? But, or even beyond Santeria, but,
you're right.
But they are special and they're unique to us and they're important, and it is part of mental health. So I'm moving more towards that reclamation of figuring out what were our ancestors doing that was nourishing to them, that was taking care of the earth, that was creating beautiful relationships between communities specifically. And that's what I'm really interested in now. I really want to dive deeper into that. And there's a lot of people that are doing the same. So it's a really beautiful journey.
First off, thank you for answering so transparently and authentically. I appreciate you sharing that story. You did mention this reclaiming of ancestral traditions. Walk us through what are some of the topics that you cover in your practice? What's the spectrum of topics that you cover?
What we really focus on is collective liberation and social justice. So it's less so about adopting, a visual yoga practice by way of like the physical poses and the meditations and all of that, although that is part of it. More so, what I'm putting out there is this idea of decolonization as a liberation practice. And so decolonization is something that anyone from any identity, whether they are white, Black, brown, indigenous, no matter what identity they hold, decolonization is something that you can begin to adopt. And that is what's going to get us to that liberation that all of us are seeking, right? That freedom, that sense of peace of mind, that sense of nourishment, that sense of balance. And so for me particularly, it's a very individual practice of decolonizing. It's a very individual practice of reclamation. And it's also very challenging because of colonization.
Yeah.
Puerto Rico has gone through a lot of challenging, violent, genocidal times, and a lot of erasure has happened from that. I think I certainly grew up, and most of us, whether you're in the diaspora or on the island, grew up thinking that the Tainos were completely wiped out off the face of the earth, and we didn't really have anything to reclaim from that era. But that's actually not true. It's been actually proven through DNA, through research, through a lot of data that Taino culture is still very much a part of our lives. And that there are, we have ancestors, a direct line to Tainos in particular. And also, the transatlantic slave trade came to our islands first. And so that mixed in with a lot of the Spaniard violence and colonization, Spaniards having the power, continued to have the power until the United States took over our island. So there's a lot of erasure that has gone on over time. And I think our people have been so resilient and so beautiful in protecting a lot of those practices, but they also had to hide a lot of those practices. So we're kind of culturally, we are a very spiritually mixed people. We have practices from Taino culture, we have practices from African culture, and we've got practices from Spanish culture. So the reclamation process has been really, really challenging, but it has also taught me so much about our people. It has taught me, and I have unlearned a lot of these myths that we have been told over and over again, generation after generation.
You brought up a really good point that there has been a lot of erasure, and unfortunately, that's to be expected when you're a colony for 122 years, the world's oldest, by the way. Fun fact for people that are listening. And it reminds me, and this is just like a super small example, is not like to equate what you just shared, but we had an interview with a chef, Roberto Perez, who has an organization called Urban Pilon. He's all about healthy eating, getting in touch with our Puerto Rican roots, and really cooking up some fire dishes. And I had him on, and we were talking about, I was sharing with him this story about me trying to make pasteles. And I I accidentally took the pasteles out of the wrap before boiling them. So I look at my wife and I'm like, well, shit, I think these are ruined. So we're like brainstorming, what can we rewrap them? Do we have rope so we could tie it up? And I said, well, let's just throw it in the oven and see what happens. So we baked these pasteles. Constanza, I kid you not, these are the best pasteles I ever had. So I'm talking to Chef Roberto Perez about this, and he's like, well, the Tainos weren't frying food. They were either grilling, maybe even baking stuff. So if anything, how you made pastelas is more in touch with your Puerto Rican roots than how we traditionally make them today. And I started thinking, like, who says that the Puerto Rican cuisine has to be all acapullas and pastelillos and all these like very like delicious, mind, I'll have you, very delicious, but not the healthiest for you. Not doesn't really give you the proper sustenance. Doesn't really like, maybe it like hits your stomach in a good way or a bad way. And you get some type of pleasure out in that, but long term, the health implications that can bring about later on in life are very dire. And my grandfather passed away because of diabetes, and I attribute a lot of that to his diet and what he was told was the right food to eat, or was a part of Puerto Rican cuisine, or just the status of Puerto Rico in general, and how there is poverty. There's not, when he was growing up, he didn't have access to that knowledge or resources where he could have a life that is filled with opportunities, resources, where he can really take care of his well-being. So very like feeling very privileged, very honored to have this discussion with you today, because I don't think previous generations had access or had those spaces created where they could have those conversations on, well, how can I really take care of myself, mind, body, and soul? So when looking at your practice, you make this point to really drive home decolonizing wellness. And I definitely want to talk about the cohorts you've created. Could you break down for our audience, what does it mean to decolonize wellness?
Well, actually, I don't think that's a backup at all. I think it's kind of layering onto what you just even mentioned around, food. We have to remember that our island in particular was an enslaved nation. I mean, it was stolen from indigenous peoples. They were enslaved if they weren't killed off. And then there were more enslaved peoples brought onto the island for multiple different free labor. And so what that does to the people of our island ancestrally is that they have to adapt, they have to survive with what they are given. So a lot of the food recipes that get passed down, we have to remember that a lot of those recipes were actually passed down from enslaved peoples who didn't have access to the same quality of food that their oppressors had or their colonizers had.
Great
so
point.
A lot of these health issues that we see in our community in particular still stems from that massive and long period of time of colonization by way of the Spanish. But also, by way of westernized culture that America brought to us in the last 122 years. Our island has not been treated well when it comes to agriculture. We have been forced to do a lot of to adopt a lot of agricultural practices that are not indigenous to us in particular. And that has caused a lot of health disparities within our own people. So I think it's really important that we not dismiss history as just something that, it happened a long time ago, it doesn't affect me today. It absolutely does. Just like spiritual practices are passed down from generation to generation, so is colonial mentality, so is a colonized mindset, so is generational trauma. And so I think it's really important that when we think of a word like decolonization, we're not just thinking of the physical aspect of a country or a government uprooting itself and leaving a nation sovereign. It's literally you are making yourself sovereign. Like you are choosing to step away from the status quo, step away from a colonized mentality. And this is an actual theory. I'm not just making this up. There are lots and lots and lots of activists before us, before our generation, that have written multiple books, thesis. They've been in academia. They've been grassroots activists. Another thing that I was remembering as you were talking earlier is that a lot of the reasons why, community has been so difficult for people to find in certain areas. particularly when you're choosing to do decolonization work, is because we can't forget that the government used to literally kill you in the street if you, talked about freedom. If you talked about liberation, you would be killed by the government. You would be killed by the state. So these are not things that, are just in the movies, right? Like, these are real things. Activists were taken away from us. Liberation activists were taken away from us by the state and to create fear in people. So sometimes what I encounter in my work is I'll use a word like decolonization or liberation or sovereignty or anything like that. And people kind of roll their eyes at me and they're like, oh, that's not possible. Or, oh, that must be like a new age thing. And it's not. Literally, our ancestors have been fighting for our liberation for centuries. Literally, the Puerto Rican anthem, it has liberation in it. La libertad. So when we forget about these types of things and when we dismiss decolonization as just like, oh, that's just like a new age thing, we can't touch that. There's actually a generational and ancestral trauma response that is coming through there that, a lot of our family members still remember when it was illegal to have the Puerto Rican flag flying up on our island, on our soil. So, when it comes to liberation, I mean it quite literally. I don't just mean it physically by way of revolution, by way of what we saw with Ricky Renuncia. I mean it by way of you as an individual choosing to get away from the status quo mentally. Colonial mentality is something that Frantz Fanon was a huge advocate of. He's kind of like the, I want to call him like the father of decolonization theory, as well as Paulo Freire from Brazil. And when we talk about decolonization by way of colonial mentality says that we as a oppressed people, as a colonized people, are adopting the same mindset as our colonizer, adopting it as our own way of life and as the standard. So it's no longer our indigenous standard, it's the colonizer standard. So Western mentality is a colonial mentality. We have adopted it as the only way of life, as the only way forward, as the only way that we can see success. And we have completely divorced ourselves from our indigenous roots, whether it's African or Taino or both. And so that reclamation process that I talk about is so important to our wellness as individuals, because that is the only way that we're going to move forward and through. Continuing to have and adopt and co-sign onto a colonial mentality is only setting us back. It's only uprooting us even more. That imbalance that we feel as far as our wellness, a lot of the reason, people start meditating is because they feel, anxious, they can't concentrate, they feel, out of balance, right? That is directly tied to this colonized mentality that we have adopted from the oppressor. So what I'm hoping to do is making this type of conversation and the type of language that I'm using here, I want to make that pretty mainstream. Like, I want people to know what I'm talking about when I say colonial mentality, and I want them to know what decolonization actually means. It's not just a buzzword. It's not a trendy thing that we use for marketing. It's an actual theory that has been passed down to us by Brown and Black philosophers, by Brown and Black activists. It's not a new age thing. It's been happening for centuries. It's just that, certain governments and certain cultures that have come onto our lands and stolen it have taught us to move away from an activist mentality. So I think we need to actually move more towards having a deep understanding of our history, as rich as it is, but also as traumatic as it has been. And once we start to understand and really move through that trauma, then we can start working towards that collective liberation that we're seeking.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the point about understanding our own history. I don't think enough Puerto Ricanos know how much of a revolutionary past Puerto Rico has. I mean, whether you're talking about El Grito de Lares or 1948's La Ley de la Mordaza, which you mentioned, how our flag was basically enacted by the U.S. appointed Puerto Rican legislature to say, now this bandera, it's a no-go. If you wear it, wave it, we could arrest you.
Right.
Which, funny enough, explains why Boricuas love putting the flag on their shoes, their hats, anything that they can put it on, they're putting it on it. Yeah.
Yeah, everything. Shot glasses,
Yeah.
card things, whatever those card things are called, bumper stickers. Literally, I have a huge flag that my dad brought from the island in my kitchen, just randomly for no reason in my kitchen. Like, why do I need a Puerto Rican flag in my kitchen? I need it. I don't know why. I just do.
Let's talk a little bit about the clients that you serve, though. So now I know you're not just working with BIPOC people. You're also working with some white folk. I don't know what the demographic is, and how many white people you have walking through your door, how many BIPOCs people walking through your door. But would you say it's about equal? Do you get more BIPOC people that come to you, or what's that breakdown? And you don't have to go into like super specifics.
Yeah. It's been very interesting. Since I started doing this work, I think initially it was a lot of white identified people. I think they were really just interested in what I had to say more so than actually learning. But over time, I have noticed a huge mix now. I get people from all over. I get people from Colombia, Venezuela, Puerto Rican. I get, white identified people. I have people who are Black American, Black African. So I think it really just depends on how people are finding me and what it is that they're looking for. Because I have shifted my message so much towards decolonization in particular, and decolonization theory, I want to be very clear, is for specifically people of color. Decolonization theory can be something that white identified people learn, but for them it's more about unsettling, meaning you recognize that you are a settler colonial and you are actively trying to unsettle, whether that's yourself physically or mentally. Now that I have shifted towards more decolonization theory, I've seen a lot more people of color really get interested in that. How do I learn about that? How do I adopt a decolonized mindset? And also incorporate anti-racism into my work, because as we know, people of color can also perpetuate racism. And, particularly in our own island, we have a lot of colorism, we have a lot of classism, and that is all part of anti-racism that we need to learn and unlearn. So it really is a mix. It's a huge mixture all the way around.
Is this a part of your 16-week mentorship program, or is that something separate?
Yeah, so I do have, it's called Thrive. It's a 16-week mentorship program, which is about 4 months. And that is something that we go through. It's a little bit, it's about 2 months of decolonization theory, and then 2 months of really figuring out how you want to show up as a leader in wellness, as a leader of color in wellness, because I only accept people of color into that program. But it's a mentorship program, so they have direct access to me and guest teachers that are actively doing this work and actively decolonizing. And it's very specific to the wellness industry because wellness leaders have been taught a really watered down and whitewashed form of wellness. We have been taught, by white people most of the time, not necessarily speaking for myself in particular, but most people, when they, become a wellness practitioner, their teachers are white. When, they become trained as either a yoga instructor or tarot card reader, for instance, or anything like that, it's typically a white person that's teaching you. And it's typically appropriated. It's an appropriated form of wellness. And so what I do is I teach you decolonization theory. And then as a wellness leader, I teach you, now here's how you apply all of this theory and start to unlearn a lot of these watered down and whitewashed appropriated practices that you've learned, and start either reclaiming your own ancestral practices or following indigenous leaders who can teach you a decolonized way of practicing. So it's very intense. It's very deep. It's like kind of throwing you into the ocean and like, I'm right there teaching you how to swim kind of. So it's really intense, but I do see a huge transformation in people after that 4 months.
And I've done some yoga in the past, not very good at it, but I've done it and I've always enjoyed it. So do you cover these topics all within different sessions of yoga? So are people going through different, like, and forgive the ignorance on how to not properly speak about the yoga practice, but is it just like, okay, now we're going to do downward dog. Let me tell you about colonization. Like,
Right.
walk us through, like, what is a typical session like?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point because most people, when I say yoga, they really automatically jump to the physical practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's me in a room full of people on sticky rubber mats, and we're all, doing the breathing, inhale, exhale, doing movements, downward dog, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's typically what people think about the yoga practice. What I practice is very different. It does incorporate that. But when you learn about the more traditional classical form of yoga, the physical postures, that is just 1/8 of the practice. There are 7 other different practices that we utilize to create a more holistic wellness practice for ourselves. That's why I say it's more of a lifestyle, less so of a, you go to a yoga studio, you pay your $18 and then you walk out and you've done yoga. Yoga is a daily experience. So what I'm teaching people is mostly through like a mentorship one-on-one experience. Less so, I still do, what most people would call a traditional yoga class. Like I will still teach the postures. Mostly what I teach is meditation and breath work, which is called pranayama. That's mostly what I teach. And it does depend on the identity of the person. I am not teaching white folks how to teach yoga, how to be a certified yoga instructor. That's not what I'm doing. What I am doing, though, is teaching you how to utilize or how to understand yoga philosophy and the tools of yoga, which are the breath work, the pranayama, the dhyana, the meditation, and the asana practice, the physical postures. I'm teaching you how to utilize those tools as part of your decolonization journey. So it all kind of weaves together. So yes, I do yoga classes, not so much anymore, like asana classes. I don't do those as much anymore, but I do incorporate a lot of these tools. For instance, in every single mentorship session that I have, we're doing dhyana and we're doing pranayama. So it is very different. And that's what I'm hoping that people will start to understand when they are part of Embody Inclusivity, is that we're trying to get away from the culturally appropriated parts of the practice, like the very trendy things that you're seeing on Instagram with the handstands and all of that stuff. That's not yoga. That's something else. And good for them, like more power to you if that's what you want to do. But that's not exactly part of decolonized yoga, particularly decolonized wellness.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down for me, because I was trying to visualize, okay, how does she do this? Like, how does she work all this into, just like based off my own previous experiences. So yeah, appreciate that breakdown. Can you tell us a little bit about your plans for the future? What is the, I had seen this on your website, the 2021 Digital Wellness Conference.
Yeah, so it's actually still in the works. But basically, I have this huge vision that I actually had earlier in the year, probably around January, February, where I'm working with one of my really good friends and collaborators on is creating, typically when people see conferences of any kind, doesn't matter if it's wellness or not, typically it's a white-led conference. It centers a lot of, like white topics, if that makes sense. And I know white is not a culture, but it's, whether it's a tech conference or a wellness conference or anything like that, it's typically it centers a lot of whiteness. And my vision is to create some sort of wellness conference or gathering. It's really more of a gathering for me, where we're featuring leaders of color, experts of color, wellness practitioners of color, teaching what they love, teaching what they know, being amplified, and having a diverse group of people come and experience what they have to offer. And we're not necessarily going to be explicit about the fact that, like, hey, this is a brown and black led conference. What we are going to be specific about is, this is a wellness conference, but we want people to start shifting their mindset towards, oh, that's nice, I'm going to support the brown and black conference, to being more so, oh, this conference looks really amazing, so I'm going to buy a ticket, I'm going to go to it. And by the way, all of the teachers are brown and black, which is a totally different experience, right? It's a totally different way of looking at us in particular. It humanizes us again. It makes us, the experts that we have been denied of being in an industry that typically centers whiteness as leadership, whiteness as experts, whiteness as successful. We know that we are very successful in our own communities, and we want to uplift that. We want to amplify that. So there's no set dates yet. I don't have any specific details past that because it's currently in the works, but I'm really excited about it, and I know it's going to be really amazing.
Dope. Okay, well, once you have all the details, logistics mapped out, definitely send that information our way. Happy to share that with our community, our social media, on our social media channels. Digital Wellness Conference, everybody, 2021. Keep a lookout. Let's talk a little bit about your practice. We talked about the future. Let's talk about your practice here in the present. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. How has your practice changed? Have you learned anything from this experience? How have things shifted for you? Break it down for us.
Yeah, it's changed a lot, honestly. A lot of my practice has shifted more towards that breath work, the meditation work, but really I've become a lot closer to community actually in this time, even through social distancing. And I'm not doing as much of the physical practice as I was doing before, honestly. And I think what I have come to the conclusion of is the physical practice for me made sense when everything, was kind of chaotic, right? It's like you go to work, you're around people. You go to your house, you might be surrounded by, family members, partner, whatever. And then you go to the yoga studio, again, you're surrounded by people. So it makes sense to do things that are constant, where you're constantly surrounding yourself by a lot of people, because that's what you're accustomed to. And that's what people make you think that your life requires, right? What I what I have learned now is that I feel more balanced when I am more focused on what's going to balance me in the moment, outside of what's trendy, outside of what most people are doing. And the physical practice for me makes sense in certain instances, and it doesn't necessarily make sense in a pandemic for me personally. For somebody else, it might actually be the opposite. They may have not loved going to your yoga studio prior to social distancing, versus now they really love doing a physical practice at home. Maybe they're taking a digital class with a bunch of people because they're craving, that's what makes them feel balanced. They're craving that sense of community and collective, movement. So yeah, I think that's what I've really noticed, is that I feel much more balanced when I'm really just focusing on my breath, when I'm really focusing on my nourishment, when I'm really focusing on how I'm feeling in the moment and paying attention to that day to day, versus, when's the next time that I can, hit the mat and do a bunch of movement. That no longer feels good to me anymore. So it's been really interesting to see how the practice has evolved. And that's not to say that, in a couple months from now, I'm going to be right back on the mat, like vigorously doing a practice 2 hours out of the day like I was before.
I do want our listeners to have a sense of how to keep up with you. So if you have any social media channels, a website, share that with our listeners. How can they keep up with you?
Yeah, definitely. So the website is embodyinclusivity.com. So you can find blog articles, you can find all of the work that I do. If you want to do some consulting, I have all of that information on there, basically what the collective is all about. And my Instagram is eliana.chinea, so Chinea. That is my Instagram. And you can also follow the Embody Inclusivity channel, which is just at Embody Inclusivity.
Beautiful. Constanza Eliana Chinea, thank you so much for being a guest on the Paseo podcast. Really appreciated having you on.
Gracias, gracias.